Okay, this is a PowerPoint on westward expansion, people. Go ahead and maximize the screen. We'll first talk about immigration and how the wave of immigration to the United States in the 1840s and 1850s led to a huge growth in population. We'll talk about some problems immigrants and African Americans faced in the North and why immigrants moved west. Not only was America's way of life changing, and what you'd want to put in right here would be immigrants. Again, immigrants were changing who Americans were. So again, as we go through this PowerPoint, as we did before, you're going to want to type in either before or after the underline. So again, either before or after line. So again, not only was America's way of life changing, immigrants were changing who Americans were. The American population grew rapidly in the 1840s because millions of immigrants, mostly from Western Europe, entered the United States. And as you can see from the arrow here, the U.S. population just soared. Some immigrants came for land, others for opportunity, and still others because they could not survive in their home countries. As cities along the eastern coast became crowded, many newly arrived immigrants headed west. So again, you would type west here. And that shouldn't be surprising that immigrants headed west. There were opportunities out west that there were not back east. In 1845, a fungus destroyed the potato crop in Ireland, which led to a famine. This would be a lack of resources, especially food. During the Great Hunger, more than 1 million people starved to death, and 1 million more left Ireland. So as you look at the chart here, you can see that through the years, Irish immigration, it peaks in 1851. This led to many people coming over to the United States. Most of the Irish immigrants who came to the United States during this period found work. Laying railroad track in the East and Midwest. Again, laying railroad track in the East and Midwest. They found work as household workers and in construction. Germans also came to America during this period, many to escape political persecution. So again, they came to escape political persecution. Unlike the Irish, German immigrants came from many different levels of society. Many Germans settled in the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes region. So again, we're talking about our state of Ohio and anywhere in the Great Lakes region. So a lot of this would be the Northwest Territory. Some Americans, called nativists, worried about the growing foreign population. Again, these were called nativists, N-A-T-I-V-I-S-T-S. Nativists especially opposed Irish immigration because most Irish were Roman Catholic. This goes back to French and English rivalries, not only politically, but religiously as well. America at this point was still more Protestant than it was Catholic. You'll find that because of France and England fighting, this led to often religious disagreements as well. When the British would often see the French, they would see them as Catholic, and when the French would see the British, they wouldn't necessarily see them as English. Politically, they would see them as Protestant. So this was a tough mix, and in the New World, the Irish didn't find a whole lot of success there. One New York nativist group became the powerful Know Nothing political party, but the party eventually dissolved over the issue of slavery. Even more so than immigrants, African Americans in the North faced discrimination. They faced discrimination. Slavery had largely ended in the North by the early 1800s, but free African Americans did not receive the same treatment as whites. Some types of discrimination in the North. Remember, we're talking about the North, not the South. Again, suffrage is voting. Many African Americans were often denied the right to vote. The right to vote. In the job market, African Americans were not allowed to work in factories or in skilled trades. Many employers preferred to hire whites. Segregation, that means being set to the side. Schools, public facilities, and churches were segregated, so African Americans formed their own churches. And then finally, the media. White newspapers often portrayed African Americans as inferior, so African Americans started their own newspapers. By the early 1800s, Western population swelled as immigrants moved west. From 1792 to 1819, 8 states joined the Union. So when we look on the map here, we can see some new states such as Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Tennessee, Kentucky. Not Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. Again, these were part of the Northwest Territory. They did become states in the early 1800s. Ohio was 1803. But remember, these were part of the Northwest Territory. That was actually, the Northwest Ordinance was written in 1787. But again, all these new states are popping up as people move from the east, the eastern coast, and they're moving westward, north and west. Okay, the next section we'll be talking about the conflict over land occupied by Native Americans in the Southeast. We'll discuss the forced removal of Native Americans and explain the Trail of Tears. So when we talk about westward expansion, we first mentioned immigrants, African Americans. Now we'll talk about Native Americans and how that relates to westward expansion. Why did Andrew Jackson use force to remove Indians from the Southeast? Beginning with President Thomas Jefferson, there had been attempts to move Native Americans westward. Jefferson hoped Native Americans would move voluntarily. So again, Jefferson was in the hope that Native Americans would just move along voluntarily without any great commotion. After the War of 1812, Native Americans in the Old Northwest gave up their lands and moved west of the Mississippi River. When you think about the Treaty of Paris that settled the American Revolution, again, land east of the Mississippi River was given to the new American government, of which Native Americans didn't always find a place in that. So again, after the War of 1812, some years later, again, Indians are being pushed west of the Mississippi River. However, the Native Americans living in the Southeast refused to move. To government leaders, the tribes of the Southeast stood in the way of westward expansion. As you can see from the arrow here, again, American settlement, driving westward, you see the native tribes, fertile farmland. Again, they wanted that fertile farmland. By the 1820s, many Southerners were demanding that the government move the tribes by force. So as the South too wanted to expand, especially their cotton production, moving westward, they needed that land, and there was pressure to have the government move these natives further west. And again, the blank here would be the pressure. The pressure on Native Americans grew. You can see in 1825, President Monroe created a plan to move all Native Americans west, but it failed. The state of Georgia forced the Creeks to give up most of their land. 1828, Georgia tried to force the Cherokees to give up their lands. The Cherokees had a distinct culture of their own. This is why there was so much pressure on them to move westward. They had adopted some white customs. They had a written language developed by Sequoyah. They ran businesses such as lumber mills. They were profitable. Many people thought if you can push the Cherokee Nation west, you would get their lumber mill. Many Cherokee learned to speak, read, and write English, and many had converted to Christianity. In 1827, they formed a constitutional government. They claimed status as a separate nation. So the Cherokee are trying to fight this out in court. Rather than just to move west, take the money and move west, they're going to end up fighting this in court. And they're saying that they're a separate nation. Remember, Native Americans were not U.S. citizens. Georgia's actions forcing the Cherokee Nation to give up their land was challenged in a Supreme Court case. This is Worcester v. Georgia, which said Georgia's laws can have no force in Cherokee territory. This is also about federalism. Again, the federal government asserted itself and said that a treaty made by the United States with an Indian nation, that was a federal treaty. Georgia, which was a state, could not override that treaty made by the federal government. So this case is not, it's loaded with all kind of problems. It's not just about pushing and removing Native Americans westward. It's also a case about federalism. And there was great tension in our government. Remember, when we go back to the very first two political parties, you had the Federalists, started by Alexander Hamilton, and the Democratic Republicans by Thomas Jefferson. The Federalists wanted a very strong central government, whereas the Democratic Republicans believed in more states' rights. In Worcester v. Georgia, Chief Justice John Marshall quoted treaties signed by the United States. In a sense, he's going to side with the federal government and with the Cherokee Nation. He said that these treaties granted territory to the Native Americans. Marshall said that Georgia did not have the right to revoke treaties made between two sovereign nations. So again, this is federalism. Again, that division of power between the federal and the state government. President Jackson opposed the Supreme Court ruling in Worcester v. Georgia. Andrew Jackson is widely known as more of a Democratic Republican. Again, he's going to side with more states' rights. In 1830, Jackson put a new federal law into effect. This is called the Indian Removal Act. The Indian Removal Act. The act gave Native Americans land in the West in exchange for their lands in the East. So basically, this is just taking the natives, pushing them out west, and kind of flip-flopping their land. When Andrew Jackson became president in 1829, more than 100,000 Native Americans lived east of the Mississippi River. Here you see a number of nations. You have the Chickasaw, the Creek, Seminole, that's in Florida, the Cherokee, and the Choctaw. Jackson's Indian Removal Act was enforced in the 1830s. The Choctaw signed a treaty giving up all of their lands. Most Native American leaders believed they had no choice. They believed they had no choice. So again, the Choctaw sign a treaty, they move on. Jackson's Indian Removal Act was enforced in the 1830s. The Choctaws moved west. They suffered greatly on their journey. The federal government failed to provide enough supplies such as tents and food. So one might wonder if the Cherokee Nation is paying attention here. They see that the Choctaws being moved west, it didn't go real well for them. The government hadn't provided enough food, etc. The Cherokees remain on their land until after President Jackson left office. President Van Buren, he comes in, and again he forced the Cherokees to leave their lands. He forced the Cherokees to leave their lands. So again, the federal government with the Supreme Court had ruled in favor of the Cherokee Nation, but again, under pressure, Andrew Jackson, a different branch of government, he's the executive branch, Jackson refuses to listen to the Supreme Court, and he sides with Georgia. And again, the Cherokee Nation will be eventually driven westward. The Cherokees' forced journey to Indian Territory is known as the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears. More than 4,000 Cherokees died on the trail due to the harsh weather and lack of supplies. One group of Native Americans, the Seminoles, they were in Florida. They refused to leave their land. The Seminoles fought 3 wars against removal. So again, they fought 3 wars against removal. Although they never signed a peace treaty, most Seminoles were forced to move in the 1840s. This will be the case for all Native tribes. In total, some 100,000 Native Americans were driven from their homes and forced to walk to a new home. In Indian Territory, Native Americans struggled to rebuild their lives in very difficult conditions. So as you see, here's the Indian Territory. You've got the original 13 colonies. Florida Territory, this was gained from Spain, the Adams-Onis Treaty. You have Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana. This is the Northwest Territory, part of the Northwest Ordinance. And as people are moving west, you can see that the native tribes are being pushed westward into this Indian Territory. Last, we'll talk about westward expansion and how this affected the women's suffrage movement. We'll talk about some of the goals of the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 and new opportunities that women gained in the mid-1800s. Some important people: Sojourner Truth. She's a former slave who spoke out for the rights of African Americans and women. Lucretia Mott, a Quaker and an abolitionist with considerable organizing and public speaking skills. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, an abolitionist who was a co-organizer of the Seneca Falls Convention for women's rights, author of the Declaration of Sentiments, co-founder of the National Women's Suffrage Association. Women's suffrage is the right of women to vote. The women's rights movement, this is an organized effort to improve the political, legal, and economic status of women in American society. And Susan B. Anthony, a close ally of Stanton's, co-founder of the National Women's Suffrage Association. How did the women's suffrage movement begin? Women participated in abolitionism and other reform efforts. So there's a lot going on in the country with African Americans, Native Americans, women. There's a lot of talk and discussion about the rights of people. Some women activists also began to focus on equal rights for themselves. So not just the rights of African Americans, but also rights for women. Most Americans believe that a woman's place was in the home at this time. The status of women in the early 1800s. Women could not vote. They could not vote, hold public office, or serve on juries. Few women received any level of higher education. Women could not work in most trades and professions. Women were paid less than men doing the same jobs. And married women lost legal control of any money or property they owned before marriage to their husbands. Women who were active in social reform movements believed that they could make valuable contributions to American society. Sojourner Truth was one of these women. She inspired the large crowds who came to hear her speak in favor of political rights, for women and enslaved African Americans. So she favored political rights. Lucretia Mott was a Quaker and an abolitionist who had considerable organizing and public speaking skills. In 1840, Mott traveled to London, this is in England, to attend an international anti-slavery convention. There she met another abolitionist, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Mott and Stanton were told that women could not take an active role in the London Convention. Furious, they decided to hold a convention to advance women's rights. They wanted to hold a convention to advance women's rights. This is going to be called the Seneca Falls Convention. It's held in 1848 in New York. More than 300 women and men attended. Here, Stanton wrote a declaration of sentiments which demanded full equality for women in every area of life. Stanton's argument was the beginning of the long battle for women's suffrage. For women's suffrage. Not everyone wanted to include women's suffrage in the Declaration of Sentiments, but in the end, the convention voted to include it. In 1869, this is after the Civil War, Stanton and Susan B. Anthony founded the National Women Suffrage Association. Women did not win the right to vote until 1920. However, the women's rights movement did win some victories in the 19th century. In 1860, New York passed a law protecting women's property rights, and many other states followed. Some states gave married women the right to keep their wages. Finally, our last slide. Causes of the women's rights movement. Women lacked many of the rights had by men. Many abolitionists, again against slavery, believed that women also deserved equal rights. The Seneca Falls Convention launched the women's rights movement. Some effects. Suffragists demanded that women have the right to vote. States passed laws to protect women's property rights, and private schools for women were opened. Some colleges accepted women. And finally, women entered careers once closed to them. So again, the PowerPoint focuses on westward expansion and people, and how immigrants, African Americans, Native Americans, women all played a part in westward expansion. Thank you for listening.